December 17th, 1944. A German 88 shell screams out of the gray Belgian sky and slams into an American supply truck on a frozen road near Arlen. The blast lifts the 2.5-ton vehicle clean off its wheels. Steel shreds. Fuel ignites. The driver never climbs out. A second truck breaks hard skids on the black ice and burns beside the first. In under 30 seconds, 2 full loads of hot rations meant for 300 men freezing in foxholes to the north are gone. Nothing left but oily smoke climbing into the pines. That fire is where this story begins. Because of it, a 19-year-old boy from Worcester, Massachusetts is about to spend 3 days without a single hot meal. And because of it, the most feared general in the United States Army is about to stop his staff car on that very road, ask one quiet question, and make a decision his own staff would call insane. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next exciting videos. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. The man at the center of it all was not the general. He was a cook. A short-order cook from a Pittsburgh diner named Donald Briggs, 31 years old, who had never wanted to be a hero. And what he set in motion over the next 96 hours would move trucks, feed thousands of men, and rewrite the way an entire American field army fed its soldiers for the rest of the war. Here is exactly how it happened. To understand the disaster, you have to understand what December 1944 had become. On the 16th, the German army did the one thing every American commander had sworn it could no longer do. It attacked. 200,000 German soldiers came smashing out of the Ardennes forest in a blizzard through a thin line of exhausted GIs who had been sent to that quiet sector precisely because it was supposed to be quiet. Whole American units simply vanished. Others were surrounded. The front line bulged inward, 40 miles in 3 days. History would name it the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest single battle the United States Army fought in all of World War II. At Bastogne, a crossroads town in the middle of it, the 101st Airborne Division was cut off completely. Encircled, freezing, running out of bullets, bandages, and food. And they were not alone. All across that frozen front, the American logistics machine, the thing that fed and fueled the greatest army on earth, was starting to break down under the cold, the chaos, and the sheer speed of the crisis. Because speed was the answer everyone reached for. 300 miles to the south, in a stone room in Verdun, General George S. Patton stood in front of General Eisenhower and made a promise that made the room go silent. He said he could turn his entire Third Army 90 degrees to the north and hit the German flank within 72 hours. In winter, on ice, under artillery. Officers laughed. Then they stopped laughing. Then they gave him the order, and Patton did it. He pivoted an entire field army, tens of thousands of men and machines in 3 days. Military historians still call it one of the most extraordinary maneuvers in the history of mechanized war. But here is the part the history books skip. When you move an army that fast, something always gets left behind. And what got left behind somewhere in the gap between a plan drawn in pencil and its execution on the ground were the field kitchens, the rolling stoves, the hot food, the trucks that fed the men doing the fighting. The 26th Infantry Division felt it first. They were National Guardsmen out of Massachusetts, the proud old Yankee division whose fathers had fought in the trenches of the First World War. In November, they had been shredded in the Saar, pulled off the line, and stuffed with green replacements who had been in Europe less than 10 days. They were supposed to be resting. Instead, on the night of the 18th, the orders came. Move north, move now, attack the German flank. They moved through ice and dark, and a wind that came down the valley like it had teeth. And behind them the kitchens fell off the back of the war. Nobody meant for it to happen. There was no villain. That is what made it so dangerous. A blown crossroads here, a truck hit by artillery there, a supply request that needed a signature from someone too busy to sign it. Small failures, each one forgivable on its own, stacking silently on top of each other, until 300 men were eating cold tinned meat with fingers too frozen to hold a spoon. The army had food, warehouses of it. The system just was not carrying it the last 20 miles to the men who needed it to survive. Which brings us back to the cook. Donald Briggs was not a soldier in the way the movies mean it. Before the war, he stood behind a griddle in a Pittsburgh diner, 9 years of it, serving 4,000 breakfasts to steel workers coming off the night shift. He knew hunger the way a doctor knows a fever. He could read it on a man's face from across a room. And by December of 1944, he had been running mess units across Europe since the breakout from Normandy in August, feeding 300 men in mud and rain and snow on the move without complaint. Briggs was in the truest sense of the word a professional. And professionals notice when things go wrong before anyone else does. He watched his hot food get farther and farther from his men. He watched 2 of his trucks burn on that artillery-swept road junction. And unlike the officers above him buried in maps and radio traffic and the roar of a battle for the ages, Briggs did something almost no one else in that frozen chaos bothered to do. He looked for a way to fix it. He found one. Studying the terrain, Briggs identified an alternate route. A back road that swung wide around the deadly junction, cut through a neighboring battalion sector, crossed a damaged but standing stone bridge, and came out right at the tree line where his starving men were dug in. It would work. It would get hot food to the 328th Infantry by nightfall. There was only one problem. Crossing into another battalion's zone required authorization above battalion level. So on December 20th, Briggs sat down and typed a 1-page report requesting exactly that. He signed it in pencil at the bottom. And then he waited. Now, here is where the story turns from tragedy into something stranger, because the idea at the heart of it was about to be treated as absurd. Think about it from the point of view of the officers around him. The largest battle in American history is raging. Bastogne is surrounded. Men are dying by the thousands. Tanks are screaming north through the snow. And into that inferno walks a request that says, in effect, stop what you are doing and reroute trucks so the men can have a hot dinner instead of a cold can. In the middle of a fight for survival, worrying about the temperature of the food sounded to a lot of tired men like a joke. So the report did not get walked across the room. It did not get flagged. It did not land on a commander's desk. It landed in a stack. On December 20th, a 25-year-old battalion supply officer named Lieutenant Frank Sykes, a young man from Cleveland, doing the best he could in a war that was far bigger than he was, set that report down on a wooden desk in a heated farmhouse. And then buried under 100 other pieces of paper, it sank. Third, from the bottom of the stack, where it would sit unread for nearly 2 full days, while a mile away, the men it was written to save slowly froze. That is the part that should terrify you. Not cowardice, not sabotage, just paper on a desk in a warm room. Briggs had done the hard part. He had spotted the problem, found the solution, and put it in writing. The idea that could feed 300 men was sitting there finished waiting. And it went nowhere. Because in the enormous grinding machine of an army at war, the smallest gears are the ones that fail the quietest, and no one hears them stop turning. Meanwhile, out at the tree line, the 19-year-old from Worcester had reached the end of himself. He had been in the same foxhole since 2 in the morning. His feet had stopped feeling like feet somewhere around dawn. At noon, they issued him a fresh box of K rations, and he could not open it. His fingers would not bend. So he sat on the running board of a stalled supply truck with his cracked, bleeding hands wrapped around nothing at all. No cup, no warmth. And he stopped expecting things. 3 days. Maybe 4. He had lost track. That was the state the world had left him in. And then on the afternoon of December 22nd, a staff car came down the frozen road and stopped behind a stalled convoy that was not moving fast enough. A man in a polished helmet with 3 oversized stars on the front got out into 14-degree cold an ivory-handled revolver on his belt and started walking down the line of trucks. He reached the 4th truck. He looked at the boy sitting on the running board. And General George S. Patton, commander of the entire 3rd United States Army, asked him a single question that no one that day expected. When did you last eat a hot meal? The boy did not even know who he was talking to. He only knew it was a general. He looked at the road. He looked back up. His mouth opened and closed. And then he said the words that were about to detonate under a warm stone farmhouse a few miles away. "I'm not sure, sir. 3 days. Maybe 4. Patton looked at the boy's cracked knuckles. He looked at his wet boots. He looked at his hollow, given-up face. And very quietly, he said one word back. "Cold." "Yes, sir." "K rations, sir." "Cold." Patton said nothing else to him. He turned, asked his aide who commanded this sector, walked back to the car, and picked up his map. And in the part of a mind that had trained for 36 years to spot the exact gap between what an army is supposed to do and what it actually does, something clicked into terrible alignment. A boy on a running board. A convoy stopped too long. A cook whose food never arrived. Patton did the arithmetic. December 22nd, minus 3 days, was December 19th. The very day his miraculous pivot began. His greatest triumph and this boy's hunger were the same event seen from two ends. He set the map on his knees. He said quietly to no one at all 3 days. Then he told his driver one word. Drive. And that car turned toward a stone farmhouse outside Arlen, where Lieutenant Frank Sykes was still sorting paper, where a report from a Pittsburgh cook still sat third from the bottom of a stack, and where 4 men had no idea that the most dangerous human being any of them would ever meet was now 6 minutes away and getting closer. So here is the question that Part 1 leaves hanging over that frozen road. What does a general do when he discovers that his own speed, his own genius, the maneuver the world would call brilliant, had left a 19-year-old boy starving in the snow? Does he rage? Does he punish? Or does he do something no field commander in that war had ever put in writing before? Because in the next 4 hours, Patton was going to walk through that splintered farmhouse door, find the report, and hand down an order so unusual that it would be quietly erased from the records just 3 months later. Kept out of his memoirs, left out of his famous diary entirely, and buried in a folder in the National Archives that barely a dozen people would ever read. An order that said, feeding the men on the line was not a comfort. It was combat priority. And failing to do it was a crime. In Part 2, we walk into that room with Patton. We meet the officer who filed the report and the lieutenant colonel who never read it. We hear the quietest, most devastating dressing down in the history of the Third Army. And we follow the 2 trucks of hot stew as they finally take the cook's forgotten route north, racing the setting sun toward a boy who has stopped believing that anyone anywhere still remembers he is alive. Part 1 ended in a stalled staff car on a frozen Belgian road, where a Pittsburgh cook named Donald Briggs had found a way to feed 300 starving men, written it down, and watched his report vanish third from the bottom of a stack, while General Patton drew closer to the farmhouse where it sat. But getting hot food to the front line was about to run into something far harder than ice or artillery. It was about to run into the system. Because in December 1944, an American infantry battalion generated hundreds of pieces of paper a day, and there was no rule anywhere that said a report about food deserved to be read before a report about anything else. Briggs had solved the physical problem. Now someone had to break the paper problem. And this is where things got worse. The staff car pulled into the courtyard of a 2-story gray stone farmhouse outside Arlen. The wooden door hung splintered where a rifle butt had gone through it days earlier. Inside, the air was maybe 10 degrees warmer than outside, which meant it hovered right at freezing. A coal stove burned in the corner too small for the room. 4 men worked there in their gloves, a clerk at a typewriter, a radio operator, a runner on an ammunition crate, and bent over a Belgian farmer's wooden desk buried under 200 sheets of paper, a 25-year-old supply officer named Lieutenant Frank Sykes. When the door opened, Sykes did not look up. He assumed it was the runner back with coffee. The runner stood so fast he knocked the crate over. Patton walked in without removing his helmet, bringing the cold in with him, and the typing stopped. The headset came off, and Sykes finally raised his eyes to the face of the most dangerous man he would ever meet. "Where is your commander?" Patton said. No question mark. Sykes pointed to a door. Behind it stood Lieutenant Colonel Carver, 41 years old, a textile salesman from Hartford. Before the war, a battalion commander for 7 months. He kept a photograph of his wife and 2 daughters in his footlocker. He was competent. He was liked. And right now, his knees would not let him sit down. "You have a private in this battalion," Patton said, "who has not had a hot meal in 3 days. I want to know why." Carver's mouth opened then closed. "Sir, I will find out. Find out now. Here is what made this moment so dangerous, and not just for the private in the snow." Patton was not looking for an excuse. He was looking for a failure, and he intended to punish it. Careers ended in rooms like this. Officers who displeased Patton were relieved of command by nightfall and shipped home under a permanent shadow. Carver knew it. Sykes, when he was called in, knew it too. Somewhere behind them, a battle was raging that would take 19,000 American lives, the bloodiest the U.S. Army had ever fought. And the general standing in this cold farmhouse had chosen in the middle of all of it to hunt down the reason one boy had gone hungry. Carver called Sykes over. The conversation was short, and it was not loud. Patton did not raise his voice. There are men who can fill a room without speaking, and Patton was one of them. The question was asked, and Sykes gave the answer that would nearly destroy him. There was a report from the battalion mess sergeant. It described a road junction under German artillery since the 17th 2 trucks already hit, and an alternate route through a neighboring sector that needed authorization above battalion level. Sykes had received it 2 days ago. He had not read it. It was in the stack on his desk. He went to find it. He had to look through the pile twice, third from the bottom. Nearly 2 full days old. Patton took the single-typed page. He read it once. He read it twice. He handed it back. He said nothing for a long moment, and the silence was worse than any shouting. Then he said 4 words that were about to change everything. "Get me the sergeant." But even as the runner sprinted out into the cold to fetch Donald Briggs, the real obstacle was becoming clear. Patton could rage at this one battalion all afternoon. He could relieve Carver court-martial Sykes and freeze half the staff with a look. And none of it would stop the exact same thing from happening tomorrow in 100 other battalions across the entire Third Army. The failure was not one lazy lieutenant. The failure was a rule that did not exist. And to fix that, Patton was about to need the one man in that farmhouse who actually understood the problem from the ground up. Donald Briggs arrived 14 minutes later on foot from half a mile away. 31 years old, a short-order cook who had served 4,000 breakfasts to Pittsburgh steelworkers before the war, running mess units across Europe since Normandy. He came to attention. Patton told him to stand at ease. "Tell me what happened," and Briggs told him. In 90 seconds. He had been waiting 2 days for anyone to ask this exact question, and the answer came out of him fully formed. The blocked junction. The 2 trucks hit. The alternate route he had scouted himself. The neighboring sector. The authorization he needed and could not get. The request he had typed on the 20th. The near 2 days of silence that followed. Here was Patton's unexpected ally. Not another general. Not a staff officer with stars on his collar. A cook. Because Briggs had done what none of the officers above him had managed to do. He had looked at a broken system and solved it on paper before anyone even asked. Patton, who had spent 36 years in uniform, learning to spot the exact gap between what an army is supposed to do and what it actually does, recognized in this Pittsburgh cook a professional who had seen the truth first. And professionals were exactly what Patton trusted. When Briggs finished, Patton did not look at him. He looked at Carver. "Did you know about this?" "No, sir." "Should you have?" A pause. There was only one honest answer. "Yes, sir." Then Patton turned to Sykes, and he became very quiet, and the men who served under Patton through 3 campaigns all said the same thing in their later years. He was the loudest man in the army when nothing was wrong. When something was wrong, he went silent. And when he went silent, you wanted to be anywhere else on earth. "You took a report about men not eating," Patton said, "and you put it in a stack. You did not flag it. You did not walk it across the room." For nearly 2 days, this report sat in this heated building in front of a man with hot coffee, while a 19-year-old a mile away ate cold tinned meat with his hands because his fingers could not hold a spoon. Sykes said nothing. He could not. Patton stepped closer. There is a kind of failure that comes from cowardice. A man runs, a man hides. That I understand. It comes from fear, and fear is human. But there is another kind of failure. A man does not understand that the piece of paper in front of him is a human being. That a report dated December 20th means that on December 20th, somewhere out in the cold, a soldier was waiting for him to do his job. That failure is the kind that loses wars. Now the plan formed fast, and it had 2 parts. Patton turned back to Carver. 2 things happen now. First, the alternate route is authorized immediately. Sergeant Briggs leaves this building in 5 minutes, and his men eat hot food before the sun goes down. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Second, Lieutenant Sykes is assigned forward to a rifle platoon effective tomorrow. 14 days in a foxhole. He eats what they eat. He sleeps where they sleep. He will learn what a report looks like from the other side of the paper. But punishing Sykes was the small fix. The real test, the official one, was the standing order Patton was about to send up the chain to 3rd Army headquarters. 1 page. And if it failed to hold, if the staff dismissed it as one angry general fussing over gravy in the middle of the largest battle in American history, 300 men would freeze and starve all over again next week. There was exactly 1 shot to make it stick. Briggs was gone within 5 minutes into a truck and racing the sunset. Now came the proof out at the tree line, where the theory of hot food met the reality of a boy who had stopped believing in it. The 328th Infantry Regiment of the 26th Division was dug in along a frozen ridge facing northeast. The sun had just dropped behind the pines. The temperature was falling through 14 degrees. And in a foxhole, the 19-year-old from Worcester had been sitting since 2 in the morning with a fresh box of K rations he could not open because his fingers would not bend. The 2 trucks took the exact route Briggs had drawn on the 20th, through the neighboring sector, past a burned-out farmhouse, across a damaged stone bridge that held. They arrived at 16:30 hours. 16:30. 4 hours after Patton stopped his car. The boy heard the trucks before he saw them. In the cold, everything that moved sounded like something that could kill you, and he thought at first it was artillery. Then the wind shifted, and he smelled it. Beef. Onions. Something like gravy. Something hot. He did not move. He could not believe his own nose. He had been smelling cold metal and his own breath for 3 days, and he was certain his brain had simply invented the smell because it had stopped working right. Then, he heard the voice. A sergeant calling out positions, calling men forward, calling his name. He climbed out of the foxhole. His legs did not work. He fell once. He got up. He walked toward the smell, and men came out of the black trees, the way deer come out at dusk, slowly in pieces, unsure it was safe. A line formed at the tailgate, and at the back of the truck stood Donald Briggs, with a ladle filling tins to the rim, saying nothing, looking hard at every single man as he came up. The boy reached the front. Briggs, who had read hunger on the faces of steelworkers for 9 years, who knew exactly what a 19-year-old who had given up looked like, filled the tin to the brim and handed it over. The boy took it in both cracked hands. The heat came through the metal into his fingers, and his fingers began to hurt, which meant they were waking up, which meant they were still his. Here are the numbers that made this a triumph, and not just a meal. Before 300 men, 3 days, 0 hot meals, fingers too frozen to hold a spoon, morale gone. After within 4 hours of 1 question, 2 trucks, 1 rerouted road, 300 hot rations delivered before dark. A report that had sat unread for 48 hours turned into hot stew in the hands of the men who needed it in 240 minutes. The system that had failed for 3 days was beaten in 1 afternoon by a cook, a general, and a road that had been on the map the whole time. The boy did not eat standing up. He sat in the snow with his back against the truck wheel and held the tin against his chest like it was the last living thing on earth. He understood somewhere under his ribs that this was not just food. It was a message. Somebody somewhere behind all the maps and radios and stacks of paper had remembered he was alive. But success in one clearing on one evening was one thing. Feeding the entire Third Army was something else entirely, and that fight was just beginning, because Patton did not stop with 2 trucks. That night at Third Army Forward Headquarters in Luxembourg City, his Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hugh Gaffey, got on the telephone with Colonel Walter Muller, the most respected logistics officer in the U.S. Army in Europe. The man who had stretched the Third Army's supply lines 400 miles across France, the man who had once heard Patton say his men could eat their belts, but his tanks had to have gas. Gaffey told Muller the general had come back from the Arlon Road unhappy. Muller asked about what. Gaffey said, food. There was a silence on the line. Then Muller said, I will get on it. Within hours, the order was drafted, signed by Gaffey on Patton's behalf, and pushed out across the entire army. Reports concerning the feeding of forward troops would be treated as combat priority. Failure to act on such a report within 6 hours would be considered a dereliction of duty. 2 cooks were added to every forward kitchen. Mess sergeants were authorized to cross battalion boundaries. The exact thing Briggs had begged for now, the law of the Third Army, and it met resistance the way every change in an old institution does. Battalions that had run their supply chains one way for months did not want to be told the mess sergeant now outranked the paperwork. But the numbers answered them. Where the order was obeyed, cold ration complaints on the line dropped toward 0 within days. Where hot food reached men, frostbite cases fell, and trenchfoot slowed, because a warm meal in a freezing body is not comfort, it is survival. On the German side, the effect was invisible, but real. The one thing they had counted on, the brutal cold breaking American morale, kept failing because the Americans kept getting fed. From an idea, a cook could not get anyone to read to the standing order of an entire field army in less than a day. But here is what nobody in that Luxembourg headquarters knew yet. That order, the one that saved men's lives across the whole Third Army through the worst of the Bulge, was going to be quietly erased. In March 1945, once the Army crossed the Rhine and supply stabilized, it would be rescinded. It would never appear in Patton's memoirs. It would never appear in his published diary. In 873 pages covering the entire European campaign, there would not be one word about the road outside Arlon. The most human order Patton ever signed was about to be buried in a folder in the National Archives, declassified decades later, read by barely a dozen people in half a century. In Part 3, we follow that vanishing. Why did the fastest general in the American Army, the man who had just fed his freezing troops through the coldest battle of the war, choose to forget it completely? Why did the boy from Worcester come home and never say the word Bastogne to his own children? And what was the single strange habit he would carry to a Massachusetts kitchen every December morning for the next 50 years, a habit his own wife would never fully understand? The battle was being won. The forgetting was just beginning. Part 1 gave us a starving boy and a cook's forgotten report. Part 2 gave us Patton's 4-hour miracle and the order that made hot food a matter of law across the entire Third Army. And as that order rolled out through the frozen sectors, something began to shift on the other side of the line, in the German command posts, where the whole gamble of the Ardennes offensive had been built on one brutal assumption. That assumption was the cold itself. The German plan counted on the weather to do half the killing. Break the American supply chains, freeze the men in their holes, and morale would collapse before the panzers even arrived. But the Americans were not collapsing. They were eating. And now it was no longer a test. It was a battle for survival, and the temperature was down to 14 degrees and falling. Here is what the German commanders did not understand as December ground on. Their entire timetable assumed a fragile enemy. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and the officers running the offensive had planned for a lightning strike 60 miles to the Meuse River, split the American and British armies, and seize the fuel dumps they desperately needed because their own tanks were running on fumes. Speed was everything. They gave themselves days, not weeks. And every hour the Americans held every foxhole that did not break, bled that timetable dry. The men in those foxholes were the reason the clock kept running. The 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee Division out of Massachusetts, was one of 3 divisions Patton had wheeled 90 degrees north. They were supposed to be resting after being shattered in the Saar. Instead, they hit the southern shoulder of the German penetration and would not come off it. Through late December, they held, and they attacked, and they held again, and it cost them. That single division would take 2,156 casualties in 1 month. That is more than the entire combat strength of a full regiment gone in 30 days. But they were fed. And a fed man holds a position a hungry man abandons. That was the invisible math the Germans never saw on any map. The German losses in the Bulge climbed into numbers that would eventually break them. Across the whole offensive, the German army would suffer somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 casualties. They committed their last great reserve of armor in the West, the tanks and men Germany could never replace, and they threw them against an enemy who kept getting resupplied, while their own fuel trucks sat empty behind blown bridges. The Germans had bet the war on a knockout blow. The blow was not landing, and Bastogne was the reason why. But holding the shoulder and feeding the line was not the only crisis. Because far to the north, a different American force was not being resupplied at all. And that was about to become the problem that swallowed everything. The town of Bastogne sat at the junction of 7 roads in the middle of the Ardennes. 7 roads. In a battle where every truck, tank, and gun had to move on frozen pavement, whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of an entire army. The Germans knew it. They needed those roads, and they could not have them as long as one American division sat on the crossroads and refused to leave. That division was the 101st Airborne, and by December 22nd, they had been completely surrounded for 2 days, encircled, cut off. The men in the foxholes around Bastogne were living the exact nightmare Patton had just fixed on the Arlon Road, except worse. They were running low on ammunition, low on medical supplies, out of bandages, and on the 20th, they had stopped serving hot meals entirely. The paratroopers were eating cold K-rations with frozen fingers, the same as the boy from Worcester, except no trucks were coming for them at all because there was a ring of German armor between them and the rest of the American army. On the morning of December 22nd, the same day, Patton stopped his car. A German officer walked into the American lines at Bastogne under a white flag carrying a typed surrender demand. It warned of total annihilation if the Americans refused. The acting commander of the 101st Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, 46 years old, read it and gave a one-word reply that would become one of the most famous words in American military history. Nuts. The Germans translating it were baffled. It meant no. It meant go to hell. And it meant the encirclement would have to be broken by force from the outside by someone fast enough and stubborn enough to punch through a ring of German armor in the dead of winter. That someone was already moving. That someone was Patton's spearhead. And now the whole story converged on a single stretch of frozen road. The unit chosen to break through was the 4th Armored Division, the tip of Patton's pivot, the same spearhead whose exposed flanks he had worried about in his diary on December 21st. Their route ran straight up from the south toward Bastogne, and every mile was contested. German infantry in the villages, anti-tank guns in the tree lines, mines under the ice, bridges blown. The 4th Armored had been fighting north for days, and they were exhausted, and they were slowed to a crawl. Then, on December 26th, at the village of Assenois, 3 miles south of Bastogne, everything came down to one column and one decision. The lead was a task force under a young lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, 30 years old, a tank commander who smoked a cigar and had been in the saddle for 96 straight hours. Abrams looked at the last German positions between him and the surrounded town. He looked at his dwindling tanks, and he made a call that was either brilliant or suicidal. He would not wait. He would not maneuver. He would ram straight through. Here is how it happened. Late afternoon, the light going gray. Abrams gives the order to charge. The Shermans open up. American artillery drops a wall of fire on Assenois. 10 battalions of guns hammer the village in minutes. The tanks roll forward through their own falling shells. Snow, smoke, diesel. The lead Sherman guns the engine and drives straight into the German line. Machine guns rake the hulls. The tanks do not stop. Infantry clings to the back decks and drops off to clear the houses. A German anti-tank gun fires. Misses. The column keeps moving. Mines detonate under the road. One half-track is hit. The rest push past the wreck without slowing. Abrams' tank punches through the last positions at 15 minutes after 4. The village is behind them. The road ahead is open, and there, across a final stretch of snow, are the outposts of the 101st Airborne. At 4:45 in the afternoon on December 26th, the lead Sherman rolls into the American perimeter at Bastogne. The men of the 101st come up out of their frozen foxholes to watch it arrive. The siege is broken. The corridor is open. And through that corridor in the hours that follow come the trucks. Ammunition, medical supplies, bandages, and hot food moving up the exact kind of road that a Pittsburgh cook had fought to reopen 4 days earlier and 40 miles to the south. In the cellar, where he had run his division for 8 days, McAuliffe put on his coat and walked outside. Abrams climbed down from his tank. The two men shook hands in the middle of a frozen street. German bodies still in the snow on either side of them, a Sherman idling behind them, the air thick with cordite and diesel. One of the paratroopers watching later said it plainly. The tanks came, and for the first time in a week, they believed they were going to live. The numbers tell the payoff. The 101st had held Bastogne for 8 days while surrounded. The 4th Armored's breakthrough on December 26th opened the corridor that turned a near disaster into the most celebrated stand of the entire battle. And it was Fed men on both ends of that corridor who made it possible. The ones inside who would not surrender, and the ones outside who drove through hell to reach them. News of the relief of Bastogne moved faster than any tank. Within days, it was everywhere. War correspondents seized on it. The surrounded paratroopers, the one-word answer, the tank charge, through the snow, the last-minute rescue. It became the story of the Battle of the Bulge, the story that would fill the newspapers, then the history books, then the movies. It was clean. It was heroic. It had a hero on a tank and a general with a cigar and a word you could print on a plaque. And it changed the whole shape of the battle. Once Bastogne held and the corridor opened, the German offensive was finished as an offensive. They had failed to take the crossroads. They had failed to reach the Meuse. They had failed to seize the fuel. By the end of January, the bulge in the line would be erased entirely, and the front pushed back to where it started at a cost to Germany of the last reserves it had. The men and machines burned in the Ardennes were gone for good, and from that point, the German army in the West only retreated. The Bulge was the last great German gamble of the war, and it lost. Patton wrote about it that night. His diary entry for the relief of Bastogne survives in the archives transcribed later by the historian Martin Blumenson. He called it the most brilliant operation the Third Army had performed, the outstanding achievement of the war. He wrote about the 4th Armored. He wrote about Abrams. He wrote about the 72-hour pivot, the weather, the Germans, the maps redrawn in pencil. He did not write one word about the road outside Arlon. Not the convoy, not the boy on the running board, not the cook, not the report third from the bottom of the stack, not the order that made forward food a combat priority across his entire army. In 873 pages covering the whole European campaign, December 22nd on the Arlon Road simply does not exist. For Patton, Bastogne was history. The hungry boy was a Tuesday afternoon. That was the shape of the triumph. The idea that had been treated as absurd in a cold farmhouse, worrying about the temperature of a man's dinner in the middle of the largest battle in American history, had turned out to be one of the quiet reasons the line held at all. Fed men do not break. Men who do not break win crossroads. Crossroads win battles. Battles win wars. It ran in a straight line and almost no one ever saw it. But here is the question that the winter of 1944 leaves behind, And it is not a question about tanks or crossroads or generals. It is a question about the men. What happened to the boy from Worcester? He would survive the Bulge, survive the war, come home weighing 38 pounds less than the day he left, and take a quiet job at a post office. And he would never say the word Bastogne to his own children, not once, for the rest of his life. What happened to the cook and the disgraced lieutenant sent to a foxhole to learn what a report looks like from the other side? And what happened to Patton himself, who within 1 year would be dead, buried at his own request among the ordinary soldiers of the army? He drove so hard, the battle was won. The war would be won. But the strangest chapter of this story is the last one. The one that happened not on any frozen road in Belgium, but in a Massachusetts kitchen every December morning for 50 years in a habit a man could never fully explain, even to his own wife. That chapter is where we are going. And almost no one knows it is there. Over 3 parts we have followed one impossible chain. A cook's forgotten report about frozen men. A general who stopped his car on an icy road and asked one question. An order that made hot food a matter of law across an entire army. And a tank charge through the snow at Bastogne that broke the last great German gamble of the war. The idea that had been treated as absurd, worrying about the temperature of a soldier's dinner in the middle of the largest battle in American history, turned out to be one of the quiet reasons the line held at all. But we ended part 3 with a question. What happened to the men behind it? And here is the twist almost no one expects. The general who fixed everything erased the whole day from his own record. The boy who was saved never spoke of it again. And the most important thing any of them did was written down, nowhere remembered by no one, and buried in a folder for 50 years. Because success sometimes comes with a strange and heavy price. Start with the boy from Worcester, because his story is the one that will not let you go. He survived the Bulge. He survived the rest of the war. The Yankee division kept fighting through January through February, across the Sour River in March, all the way to the link-up with Soviet forces in May. He was wounded twice. He came home in September of 1945, weighing 38 pounds less than the day he left. And then he did the most ordinary thing imaginable. He went back to the small town outside Worcester, took a job at the post office, married a woman he had known in high school, and had 3 children. He did not talk about the war. This is the part that is true about far more men than you know. When his children asked, he said it was cold. When his grandchildren asked, he said it was a long time ago. When the local paper ran a feature on the 35th anniversary of the Bulge in 1979 and asked for veterans willing to be interviewed, he did not call. He went to work. He came home. He read the paper. He shoveled his own driveway in winter long after his sons were old enough to do it for him, because shoveling was something he could do without thinking, and on certain days he needed to do something without thinking. But he had one habit his wife never understood. Every year on the first truly cold morning of December, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the wind came down off the New England hills with that particular edge, he got up before sunrise and made a pot of coffee. He did not drink it right away. He set the pot on the back of the stove where it would stay warm. Then he sat at the kitchen table in the dark and looked out at the snow on the lawn. She asked him once in 1963 why he did it. He thought about the question for a long time. Then he said only this. There was a day a long time ago. I was very cold, and somebody made sure I got something hot. She waited for more. He did not say more. She never asked again. He died in 1993, at 68 of a heart attack in that same kitchen on a December morning, with a pot of coffee warming on the back of the stove. His youngest son found him. But the boy's real legacy is not in that kitchen. It is in what his silence tells us about an entire generation. Because the boy from Worcester was a composite, a figure built from the documented experiences of thousands of men in the Third Army during the Ardennes. No single private, no single cook, no single supply officer is named in the record of December 22, 1944. But the cold was real. The hunger was real. The kitchens that fell behind the spearhead were real. And the silence afterward was the most real thing of all. There were 2,800,000 men who served in the European theater. The youngest of them, the ones who lied about their age at 16, would be in their late 90s today. You may have sat across a dinner table from one of them for 18 years and never once heard him say the word Bastogne. Not because they were cold men, because they had carried something so heavy for so long that they had learned the way you learn to live with a bad back, to carry it without describing it. That is the legacy of the men. Now consider the legacy of the idea itself, because that one did not stay buried. The order Patton signed in December 1944, the one that made feeding forward troops a combat priority with a 6-hour deadline, was quietly rescinded in March 1945, once the army crossed the Rhine and supply stabilized. It never appeared in his memoirs. It never appeared in his diary. It survived as a single page in a folder in the National Archives, declassified in 1972, read by perhaps 11 people in the next half-century. On paper, it vanished. But its principle did not, because the thing that order recognized that a fed soldier is a soldier who holds, and a hungry one is a soldier who breaks, became one of the permanent lessons of modern war. The American military that emerged from World War II built an entire logistics doctrine around the idea that supply is not the boring tale of an army, but the thing that decides whether the army can fight at all. Hot food forward. The mobile kitchen that keeps pace with the advance, the treatment of a soldier's meal as a component of combat power rather than a comfort, all of it hardened into standard practice. You can trace the line forward. In Korea, in the brutal winter of the Chosin Reservoir in 1950, the difference between units that could feed and warm their men and those that could not was again a difference measured in survival. In Vietnam, the effort to get a hot meal to men in the field became a point of doctrine and morale that commanders obsessed over. And in the modern military, the systems that push food, water, and fuel to soldiers at the very edge of the fight are considered so central that logistics officers now sit at the heart of every operational plan, not at the margins. The armies of dozens of nations that studied American operations in the 20th century absorbed the same core truth. An army does not run on courage alone. It runs on what reaches the man in the hole. The scale of that lesson is almost impossible to count. How many lives across, how many wars across how many armies were saved by the simple institutional conviction that the report about hungry men gets read first? It cannot be tallied in a single number, but it is measured in the millions of soldiers who in the 80 years since that frozen road were fed on time because someone before them had learned at terrible cost what happens when they are not. But the biggest lesson of this story was never really about food or logistics or even war. It was about the report third from the bottom of the stack. Think about what actually failed on that road. Not courage, not competence, not equipment. What failed was imagination. A 25-year-old lieutenant in a heated farmhouse looked at a piece of paper and did not see the human being at the other end of it. He did not understand that a report dated December 20th meant that on December 20th, out in the cold, a man was waiting for him to do his job. That is the failure Patton named in that quiet, terrifying voice. Not the failure of a coward which comes from fear and is human. The failure of a man who forgets that paper is never just paper when there is a person at the end of it. And that failure is not confined to 1944. It is the failure of every institution that has ever been too big, too busy, or too tired to notice the one signal that mattered, buried among 100 that did not. The good idea that comes from the bottom of the hierarchy, from the cook, the mechanic, the clerk, the private, and dies not because anyone rejects it, but because no one important enough ever reads it. History is full of these. The insight ignored because of who it came from. The warning filed and forgotten. The obvious fix that everyone was too busy to walk across the room. What made December 22nd different was not that the system worked. The system had already failed for 3 full days. What made it different was that one person with the authority to act chose to stop the car, to ask the question that did not need to be asked, to read the page that had been sitting unread. Patton did in his own mind almost nothing that day. He stopped. He asked. He gave an order. He went home and wrote about something else entirely. But that nothing was everything because it was the one thing the machine could not do for itself. It took a human being deciding to look. And there is one final detail that almost no one knows. Remember the disgraced Lieutenant Frank Sykes sent forward to a rifle platoon to spend 14 days in a foxhole to eat what the men ate and sleep where they slept to learn what a report looks like from the other side of the paper. For decades, that punishment reads like the harshest note in the whole story, a career broken over one unread page. But look closer at what Patton actually built into it. He did not send Sykes home. He did not end him. He sent him to learn. The punishment was not exile. It was education. Patton took the man who had failed to see the human being behind the paper, and he put him in the exact place where he could never fail to see it again. In the hole. In the cold. Waiting for the trucks himself. It turns out that was the whole point. Patton did not want a scapegoat. He wanted the lesson to take root in the one man most likely to carry it forward for the rest of his career. That was not cruelty. That was the deepest kind of instruction, the kind that only works when it is felt in your own frozen fingers. The man who learns hunger from the inside never files a report about hunger casually again. And multiply that one lieutenant across an army that made the lesson into law, and you begin to see how a single question on a single road echoes for 80 years. So here is the whole story in the space of a few breaths. A cook found a way to feed starving men, and no one would read his report. A general stopped his car, asked one question, and made feeding the men a matter of law across an entire army. The men who were fed held the line. The line held the crossroads. The crossroads broke the last German offensive of the war. And every man involved either forgot it, hid it, or never spoke of it again. From a short order cook with a rerouted road to an order that helped hold the largest battle in American history. From a 19-year-old, too cold to hold a spoon, to an old man making coffee at sunrise for 50 Decembers because somebody once made sure he got something hot. From a page third from the bottom of a stack to a lesson that would feed millions of soldiers in every war that followed. The proof was never in the medals, because there were no medals for this. It was never in the history books, because it was never written in them. It was in a pot of coffee on the back of a stove, warming for no one in a Massachusetts kitchen every December, until the man who made it was gone. The convoy moved. The boy ate. The general drove on. And somewhere in that ordinary miracle is the only lesson that ever really mattered. That most of the time in most of our lives, nobody stops the car. The report stays in the stack. The cold continues. But every so often, someone chooses to look, chooses to ask the question that did not need asking, chooses to read the page. And when they do, a boy who had given up gets a tin of hot stew at 4:30 in the afternoon and lives another 50 years to prove it was worth it. That is the power of the question no one had to ask. Ask it anyway.